Okay, well, I think we can probably crack on then. Not entirely sure how many people we're going to get tonight, but good evening to those of you who've turned up, and I'm sure others may well join us as we come along. Anyway, welcome to the Bovey, Tracey, Devon Wildlife Trust local group Winter Talks programme, which is this year, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, going to have to be held on Zoom, which is a new venture to us all. We're hoping that it's going to run smoothly. We've had various practice runs, but there's nothing like trying it in real time. These talks will be delivered as usual on the third Tuesday of the month at 7:30, in the same way the usual face-to-face winter programme would be. And they're going to run from October to March, just in the same way that the usual face-to-face meetings would have done. And if anything should change, we'll go back to using face-to-face meetings. But as things stand at the moment, we could only admit about 30 people to the church hall, and so that would rather defeat the object. So just a heads up for next month, before we come on to this evening's talk. That's going to be a talk given by Jasmine Atkinson, and it's all about the hedgehog, everybody's favourite. And then over the winter, we'll be covering a variety of topics, including the effects of climate change on wildlife and weather, things about wild Dartmoor and its ecology, bumblebees, marine conservation zones, which you may know are springing up around our coast. So hopefully there's something there for everyone, but should you have any ideas for talks or speakers, then your committee would be only too pleased to hear from you. So please let us know. Some of you, I hope, will have noticed a copy of the newsletter going out just this evening with the heading "Important Message" on it. And of course, communicating with people via a newsletter, trying to get in touch with those people that don't open them is a pretty thankless task, which is why that rather abrupt message was on the header of the email. But our problem is that as a charity, we have a limited number of email addresses which we can use to send our email newsletter out to, and we're just about reaching our maximum capacity. Now, actually only about 60% of people on that list ever open the newsletter, which means we've got redundant capacity. But if we can, we'd like to get hold of those people who are no longer interested in seeing the newsletter and just get them to unsubscribe so other people could be invited to use it. So that was the purpose of that message. And if you know of anybody just in idle chatter around the place who is in that sort of situation, if you could prompt them to unsubscribe, we'd be very grateful. Otherwise, we'd have to find funding somewhere to buy expanded capacity, and we don't have any funds, so it's going to be slightly more difficult. So we'd like everybody to remain with their video and their audio links muted if you could. This is helpful to us because it reduces the amount of bandwidth or capacity on the internet link that we have available to us. But it reduces the amount that we're actually using, and it allows us to hand it all over to our speaker and try and stop him freezing and breaking up mid-sentence and making the whole thing unintelligible. So looking at you, you do look like you've nearly all done that, so thank you very much for that. During the talk, we will be inviting people to ask questions, but we ask you to do that using the digital messenger facility. Now, if you're on an Android or a laptop or something like that, the toolbar at the bottom shows a little icon that says chat, and if you click on that, then you are able to type in a question. Could you address that to John White privately rather than to everybody? Otherwise, everybody's going to get your questions and then we'll gobble up bandwidth as well. John, our chairman, will then collate all of these questions and group them into topics and present them to our speaker, and hopefully he will be able to answer them all. And if there are any supplementary questions, then we may be able to open up the audio at the end of it and invite those, but we'll see how we get on with that. So to our speaker tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Pete Burgess, who's the Devon Wildlife Trust Director of Conservation and Development, I think is right, isn't it, Pete?
That's right.
He's a member of the DWT leadership team, and he has worked for many years in conservation and land management sector within Devon, been involved in a whole variety of different things over the years, including the Greater Horseshoe Back project and the Culm Grassland development. And I think I'm right in saying from your biography, Pete, that your roles are sort of establishing county-wide partnerships with various people supporting rural regeneration and environmental projects and developmental projects and the like. So anyway, Pete's going to talk to us tonight about rewilding. You may have noticed that initially this was advertised as rewilding city parks, but I think that was a bit of a narrow topic. And although I think Pete's going to address a bit about city parks, his talk is to be about rewilding in general. So without further ado, if I can hand over to Pete, and we'll try and by the magic of technology share his computer screen and he can give his talk.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon, and welcome everyone. I hope everyone's all well, and it's great to see everyone here. I'm a fellow Bovey resident, and I can see some friendly faces and see some names that I recognise. So yeah, without further ado, I'll start my presentation. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 3/4 of an hour or so is about rewilding. This is a really inspiring topic and has the potential to really revitalise the wildlife that we have in our county, in our country as well. But it does spark some controversy, and there is some level of confusion about actually what does this word mean. So I'm going to spend a little bit of the time just sort of, I think, debunking some of the myths. There'll be a little bit of science in there around some of the theories around rewilding, but I hope some of the inspiration around what the potential of this action will be. But yeah, starting off with a controversy, it places in France that I've been, where if anyone can translate that, it's essentially the lynxes and wolves aren't amongst us. They're not welcome. But hopefully, as we move on, other wildlife will. So what I want people to just start off and thinking about is just about what is natural. Do we have any natural places in our county? I think quite often we'd think, oh gosh, yes, we've got our valley woodlands or other variety of different habitats which are natural. But really, we don't. There aren't any natural habitats in our county, in our country, most of Western Europe. The only places that really could just about touch the definition of natural would be areas like cliffs, recently slumped cliffs. So Axmouth Lyme Regis area, where you've got that really dynamic cliff systems, where new habitats are constantly being created. You can see that image there across to Portland from, that's probably touching into Dorset there, but let's argue it's in East Devon. Here's a place not many people I expect have been to, but I've been to the bottom of it. It's the Devil's Slide on Lundy, amazing slab of granite. These are the sorts of places where you could argue are potentially natural, that haven't had the imprint of humans on them. And they're largely in a natural state, apart from the two climbers which are rubbing chalk into that cliff face. But really, those habitats that we have are being influenced by global temperature changes. Global warming, that's influencing the wildlife that's there, the type of weather those environments are experiencing. We've heard just 2 weeks ago we had the wettest day over the country on record, and that wasn't many months after we had the sunniest May on record. So it's without question, man-made climate change or human-induced climate change is a fact, and that's borne out just in looking at this sort of data going back to 1800. But our species are also really impoverished, and many of them are at risk of extinction. So if you think about these spaces which may just about be natural, they're being influenced by climate change, by atmospheric changes, by changes in species assemblages. So they're not natural. They are, a pale shadow of what natural would be. So that brings us on to, well, this idea of rewilding. Can we make these places more natural, more wildlife rich? What does it mean? And it is inspirational, and various people have commented on what this subject means and what it means to them about bringing nature back on the grand scale. And you have a sort of spectrum of commentators, those like George Monbiot, which are perhaps on one end of the spectrum about bringing back, long lost carnivores from this country, and through to those that actually, well, I could allow much more nature into my farm, for example. But we love to put things in pigeonholes as scientists, and here's just a sort of selection of the types of rewilding, as people have thought more and more about this subject. So, from one end about restoring big wilderness, lots of regulatory systems, the role of large carnivores in terms of how they're influencing nature, right through to looking at Pleistocene rewilding, trying to think back to just the last ice age and what wealth of wildlife there was at that time. How can we try and replicate that sort of system? I don't like the term passive rewilding, but this is probably more what we think about in terms of bringing back as much natural process as you possibly can, putting nature in the driving seat. And then over on the other end of the spectrum about translocation wilding. So this is about trying to restore processes by bringing back species which have become extinct. Now, the best way I like to think about rewilding is it's about putting nature in the driving seat. It's about us taking a step back. It's not about us completely leaving nature to its own devices, but nature and natural processes will shape the environment more than we do. And that's really important. And the whole idea of natural processes is something I'll just start on in the presentation. And one of the most dominant, I don't know if anyone's seen the recent David Attenborough film, but I'd produced this presentation before I saw it. And then I started to see images, and David Attenborough was in here in Chernobyl, looking at how wildlife had recolonized this area. And that's one of the really important natural processes that shape our countryside and areas of wild land, is about succession. Nature has the ability to bounce back, even in the face of catastrophic nuclear fallout. This is now one of the most nature-rich places in Eastern Europe. The wildlife here has been able to start to recolonize what we would call quite a disturbed environment. So disturbed, i.e., humans have had a really major impact on it. We poured lots of concrete, built all these buildings, yet we walk away and literally, evolutionary, in the blink of an eye, wildlife has come back. Seeds have blown in. Those colonizing species of plant have given rise to new habitats, and with that, a whole range of species. So the dominant process here really is about succession. And this is an important ecological process, which is often quite ordered. It's about starting, in this instance, what we call primary succession. So if you started with an area of bare rock, how does that progress from being bare rock to, say, a woodland habitat over many, many years? So bare rock starts to erode. It creates just the right sort of niches for certain species to cling on to, like the lichens. The lichens attract dust, they decompose. Gradually, over time, you get organic matter in those systems. Species like grasses and perennials are able to blow in on the wind, and actually then quite quickly you get through the stages of woodland growth. In Western Europe, it would be woodland, through to what we call a climax community. And that's where that vegetation community is quite stable. And we've seen that very recently. So this is Surtsey, I think 1963, volcanic eruption near to Iceland, and through the actual birds and the weathering of the rock, guano from birds, etc., that is now a habitat which is developing and is reasonably wildlife rich in a fairly short space of time. So here is just that first-hand example of how succession works, that natural process of vegetation colonizing areas of land. Now, we don't actually have to go back that far in history for people not to understand that that was a dominant force in our environment. People probably thought, well, if I left a field, it probably would remain grassland. So one of the longest ecological experiments that's still going today is called the Broadbalk and Beescroft experiment at Rothamsted Research in Hertfordshire. And they went out to test just that. So if you left an area of cornfield, what would happen? And they tested, surveyed and monitored for, and still are, the changes that those fields went through and experienced to become a woodland environment. So us in Western Europe, you leave even small ponds, wetlands, generally they will move towards a woodland habitat. And that led people, eminent professors and people that I read a great deal about, Oliver Rackham here, to propose what our country used to look like before we had any more influence on the landscape than the animals which we preyed upon. So pre-agriculture. So what did our country look like? He suggested we had this thing called wildwood. So our country was generally closed canopy woodland, and they were different types of woodland depending on where you were. So we're just really on that western side, on the brown there of Devon and Cornwall, oak hazel woodland, the majority of the southeast dominated by lime. He looked back into pollen records, and that was the suggestion, that we had this virtually wall-to-wall woodland habitat. And this is a lovely view, me as a Bovey resident, one that I know quite regularly. So this is from looking down into Lustley Cleeve, Bovey Valley woodlands. Ignore what's in the distance, but this is what was suggested. This is oak, birch, ash woodland. This is what we would have had in our county, and it would have been wall to wall, and that's what was natural. So if that's the case, where did all these other things come in that we know and love as our wildlife of our county that's super special? Here, green-winged orchids on the top left, our primroses, our special grasslands, our wet grasslands, our culm grassland habitats, upland blanket bog, heathlands, that's Bovey Heathfield there on the bottom right. Where were those habitats in this closed canopy woodland? Well, we know those habitats existed, but where were they? What about our treasured species, barn owls? Where were hen harriers, nightjar, ringoozle, dunlin, Dartford warbler, keeled skimmers, marsh fritillary butterflies, common blue butterflies? The list goes on. Most of our species that we see are often woodland edge species. They're not closed canopy woodland. There are many species within closed canopy woodlands, but there's an awful lot which aren't. So if there was this thing that was closed canopy woodland, this wildwood across all of our landscape, well, there wasn't much space for this lot. And that's where natural processes come in. So there were other things influencing how our landscape looked, and it was much more dynamic, and it wasn't just this stable area of woodland. Now we have to think then, well, what sort of natural processes do we have that aren't just succession that I talked about earlier? You leave an area, it gradually becomes woodland. So fire, fire is a really important natural process in many parts of the world, certainly not in the UK, but as we've witnessed, unfortunately, climate change driven in Western America and California recently, although many of the woodland ecosystems there require fire for their seeds to germinate. So that's an important process, but not one for the UK. Large storms, yeah, absolutely. Large storms would have had an influence over our woodland and opened up large areas, but not perhaps large enough for the range of biodiversity that we have in our country. Flood? Yep, certainly. Flood would have an impact, but perhaps just in the floodplain. And not many floods occur so frequently as to change woodland cover. And then there's coastal processes, so our sand dune systems and so on, and that would just influence that coastal strip. So there's one other, heavy snowfall, something of a bit of a memory, but heavy snowfall is a natural process which can actually really change woodland and woodland ecology and woodland structure. So when I'm talking about scales of natural processes, there's a bit of a common theme which comes through here. This is the Pripyat River, so just between, well, near Belarus, north of Chernobyl. And this is full-scale wetland natural processes at work. These are really dynamic wetland systems. This is a huge landscape that is shifting and changing, big river delta systems, and the rivers there are changing the environment and disturbing it and stopping it becoming a woodland environment all of the time. So what was happening in our country? And it actually took a remarkably long time before people really did come to the conclusion that there were these other things which were having an influence on our habitats. And it was actually a Dutch professor, Frans Vezere, who proposed that actually large grazing herbivores were one of the dominant natural forces influencing how our landscapes look. And here he's actually what he refers to as the mother oak. These are hawthorns which protect oaks as they grow up into high canopy woodlands, and then grazing animals would be constantly shifting and changing within those landscapes and opening up new areas. So I think Frans Vezere was one of the key ecologists that started to change the way people thought about our land and its management. But actually there was evidence that was staring us in the face all over the place about what was the natural dominant forces and natural processes in our landscape. And I had what I describe really as quite a life-changing experience of going to Font de Gaume in, apologies if that's the wrong pronunciation, in the Vezere Valley in Dordogne, where our ancestors produced a lot of cave paintings, and these cave paintings are 20 to 30,000 years old, deep inside some of the caves, some of the few that you can still actually visit and see firsthand rather than replicas. Funnily enough, they're painting what was a major influence on our landscapes. So aurochs, so the ancestors of our modern cattle breeds, ibex, bison, herds of ponies, wild ponies, wolves, bears, etc. So these were the things, these very large herds of herbivores. I should add that wild boar in that as well. They had a major influence. It was these big herds that were keeping our woodlands and our habitats in a constant state of flux and change and a more wild state. So, these are some of our last remaining bison that we have in Europe, in some of the larger woodlands of Eastern Europe. These are conic ponies of Poland. Actually, our Exmoor ponies are some of the most ancient breeds that, their bloodlines can be traced back thousands and thousands of years. These are Tamworth pigs, but they're replicating what wild boar would have done in the past at the Knepp Rewilding farm. And there is it's actually a fascinating story about that. That's the closest you'll get now to auroch of the past. So that's Simon Brenman, who used to be, he's just recently retired, was our director of Southwest Wildlife Trust. And Rewilding Europe understood that aurochs were the ancestors of our modern and our cattle. So there must be auroch bloodlines in cattle still. So they went to seek out where those bloodlines may be strongest, and they found a couple of locations. One in particular was Spanish fighting bulls, and a number of other herds which were in some very rural, remote locations, and started to breed them back. And they have now got all which resembles in every single way the aurochs of the past. I certainly wouldn't have my back turned to turn to one of those, but it's a fascinating experiment and work to have animals that are able to replicate and be analogues of the sort of historical grazing these animals once did. And you don't have to go far into the continent now to see the predators that you would have preyed on those beasts. Wolves, brown bear. I mean, 24 hours in the ferry to northern Spain, and you're in and amongst wolves and bears in the mountains. You go back 20 to 30,000 years, and we would have been sharing our landscapes with woolly rhinos, straight-tusked elephants. You put those into woodland environments and they can certainly make them shift around. So these were species in Northern Europe. So the idea of there being this quite stable woodland environment was just not the case. These were dynamic environments, constantly shifting and changing, always disturbed, and places where a whole raft of different biodiversity that we know and love today would have had niches to be able to exist. I'm just going to spend a little moment now talking around the theories around keystone species, because this is a really important element of rewilding. So theoretically, as it goes, so there are certain species that we have in our landscapes, in our ecology, that have a far greater influence over wildlife than just their biomass themselves. So I think historically we would have looked at a whole range of food webs and thought, well, you can just remove one of those species and it will still carry on in the state that it was previously. But we know that's completely untrue for certain species. So you remove wolves, for example, from a situation in Yellowstone Park, the number of browsing animals and deer, etc., go up. They don't feel the fear of having wolves around. They behave much more differently. They overgraze the woodland environments. The woodlands become much more sparse, and biodiversity declines as a result. So there are certain species which exert a massive influence over their environment relative to their biomass. Here's one, top predator, the otters, sea otters of the northern Pacific and the American west coast. Now they love sea urchins, and not many other things predate on sea urchins. You start taking out otter populations in large numbers, as they were with the fur trade, then sea urchins do really rather well. So thank you very much. Sea urchins are herbivores. They love kelp, and they remove the kelp forests. And the kelp forests are just these huge underwater, literal forest ecosystems, or algal ecosystems, where they're nursery areas for a whole range of fish. Whole ecosystems are based around it. You knock out one species and it's devastating. You get what they call a trophic cascade. So it's a loss of a whole raft of different species. And this chap we have to thank for finding more out about this. If you do get a chance, I think it's on Netflix, it's called a program called The Serengeti Rules, and it is absolutely fascinating because these concepts of keystone species are really hard to prove in the wild. By its very nature, biodiversity is infinitely complex, and it's really hard to test that if you took out one of these species, what would happen. And this chap is an eminent professor. He stumbled in Washington state, these rock pools, and saw these top predators of starfish and thought, I know, I can remove those and I can see what will happen. So that's him on the left there with his crowbar. And he used to crowbar starfish away from their latched onto the rocks where they were and throw them into the sea. They weren't harmed, I hope, in the process. And then he monitored what would happen to those ecosystems. And before, you had these amazingly diverse rock pool habitats, a whole raft of different species, lots of energy flows between all the species, lots of predation between this really complex environment. He took the starfish out, and 1 year after removal, that system becomes very simple. The mussels, the barnacles, etc., are having a far greater influence over that the ecology of that area than they previously did. And within 5 years, they were just dominated by mussel beds. What were previously species rich and ultra diverse became literally single species. So through that, he proved that there were these things called keystone species, and there are numerous keystone species that we have, and we've had in our country, some of which are present, some of which are not. And this one completely threw me in terms of the process that wildebeest used to have in the plains. The more wildebeest you have, generally, the more woodland you have. And that seems completely counterintuitive. Now, the system there is actually based around seasonal burning. If you have lots of herbivores, they chew and eat the grass. There's less fuel for fire, less intensity of fire, therefore less chance that the woodlands and the trees in that landscape would be killed by burns. And the outbreak of Rinderpest and the impact on their populations actually led to less woodland cover as a result of their near demise, actually, until their populations have started to recover. So sometimes, you can be thrown by thinking, that herbivores are always going to have a negative impact on woodland or reduce woodland. It can be the opposite. Now back to one of our favorite keystone species, and one that we've just had the most wonderful news. I think of what will be my career around the fact that beavers are now back for good in Devon and England, and probably the UK after the end of the River Otter beaver trial. And these are to call them ecosystem engineers is an understatement. They're an absolute force of nature, and having them back in our rivers and waterways will be a real game changer for the health of watercourses. If you refer to that as rewilding, well, potentially it's bringing back a natural process, but that natural process is within quite intensively managed farmland, but it's going to have a really positive effect on our wetlands. And when we started out our work with beavers at Devon Wildlife Trust with various partners, and in this case, the University of Exeter, we embarked on some of the most detailed scientific investigations that we've done to date. This shows one location where we first released beavers in West Devon into a 3-hectare enclosure. This was back in 2011, and this shows a plan view of the beavers. When they were first released, I don't know if you can see my cursor, we dug a little pond for them. And this was just basically a wet trickle that went through an area of calm grassland. And the beavers were given some water and a small area for a lodge. And with the help of archaeologists who are brilliant at plan drawings, if you ever need anyone to do plan drawings outside, get archaeologists involved. We looked at how the beavers started to influence that landscape. So a year on, we had far more, the black lines are dams. Sorry, I should say, this is water in at this end, water out at that end. The black lines are dams. The gray areas are water bodies. So that was a year after, 2 years after, 3 years after, 4 years, 5 years. So in that space of time, what was a very simple wet trickle has basically become 13 separate ponds holding 1 million litres of water, a dynamic wet woodland environment in there, absolutely alive with wildlife, which I can testify after being in there by being bitten by so many of the creatures which live in those wetlands. Amphibian numbers that just up exponentially. So if you replicate that over larger areas of our upland wetland systems, their influence will be huge. And actually, it's quite alien to us. We're getting used to it now, but this is how our wetlands would have looked in the past. This is a much more natural system. And if you harness nature, it helps you out. And this is something I hope some of you have seen before. This is again the plan drawing of the beavers, their dams. So water comes in here on the blue arrow, comes out there on the left on the red arrow. That water comes in and it passes through 13 dam systems. And with the University of Exeter, we installed weirs at top and bottom so we could measure the water flow. And this is some of the most important information that we've revealed from the beaver work in terms of what they can do for flood risk. So if you see the water coming into site, above beaver is the blue line. So above all the beaver activity, you can see on these rainfall events, the water is what we call very flashy. It's very spatey, and it's these peaks and the flood hydrograph which are the most damaging. So when you get water rush really quickly through a system, through your village, through your town, through anywhere, it's the most damaging. And above beaver, you can see that peak. It's virtually eliminated through 13 dams. You can see a steady rise in the water table in terms of how that water's flowing out from the site. And that is absolutely critical in being able to demonstrate the flood risk benefits from beavers, but the reverse is also true. So beaver dams are leaky. So they store water and they release water in periods of drought. So when we had May, June period this year, some of our leaks in Bovey Tracey dried up. Yeah, if you've got a slow release system of filtered water, the chances of dry watercourses will be much lower with beavers in our system. So these are ecosystem engineers, but they're also species which can do a huge amount for us, for humans and where we live. And there's been some other rewilding projects and work which has been inspirational, and one that I would really recommend anyone to visit, everyone to visit, is what Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell have led at the Knepp Estate. So they started with a few thousand acres of mostly winter wheat, winter barley. They're really struggling to make ends meet. You know, there was a huge amount of input that they were having to put into that land to get very small margins out. And they thought about what the other options might be and how rewilding might fit that system. And what they have enabled and created is been absolutely groundbreaking. So from an environment which was relatively sterile, to now one which is full of species that we consider, especially in Devon, to be things of the past. You know, turtle doves, we've got a few in the county, but nightingales, common over the site. Purple emperor butterflies, again common, and that's created because of the environment that they've created there, but also the fact that they've got analogues of those old herbivores. So they've put species in to replicate those herbivores and what they did in the past. So Tamworth pigs, cattle of various sorts, soon to be bringing beavers back. If anyone has a chance to read the book, do. It's fantastic. So I just kind of think, looking now a bit to the future in terms of what can we do? Where can rewilding and wilding fit, you know, with us and how we manage land and our needs from land, and the era that we're now in, which many are calling the Anthropocene, where we're starting to have an impact on the planet, which will be you know, visible to future geologists when they look back and say, that was that period when humans started to actually start shaping the planet and landform rather than just the vegetation on its surface. So when we look at species and various indices around species and how our species and habitats are faring, you know, the picture is rather bleak. And you know, these are species of looking at bird indices. So the line across the top is the sort of baseline going back to 1970. And you look at all species there: seabirds, woodland birds, farmland birds especially. are not faring very well, and the declines are really significant. And that's replicated in a lot of species. So this is trends in butterflies. If you, the specialists are faring even worse. So specialist butterflies that require specific habitats for their life cycle have declined rapidly. But the big problem with this is that we just go back to 1976 or 1977. And we really do have a problem with shifting baselines. If that's where we go back to, I think we're missing our ambition, where what we should be looking at and how we're restoring our precious wildlife. Again, you know, this is amazing work that's been done by Devon birds and the bird atlas. You look at 1977, the year I was born, that cuckoo were everywhere across the county, pretty much apart from the uplands of Dartmoor, the very high moorland areas, and they're now really restricted to the fringes of Dartmoor. But the baseline we look at is 1977. I don't want my children to be thinking of future where lapwing are just, you know, a species that you only see in 1 or 2 places in Devon. We should be thinking, well, in the future we should be having corncrake back in our county. You know, I've grown up believing that corncrake are a species of the Western Isles of Scotland. Well, you don't have to go far back in time in Devon to know that corncrake were just part of the summer soundscape. Our meadows have declined in significant proportions. Perhaps 97–98% of our species-rich grasslands have declined. So we need to do something and to restore nature at the grand scale. These are just images of our areas of culm grassland in Devon. This is the area of Heartland, Bursden Moor, right up in the northwest of Devon. That was the extent of culm grassland back in 1947. I just did some quite crude assessments looking at the type of habitat. You can see the natural sort of runnels and waterways which flow through that landscape. It looks quite wild. That's present day, and that's as good as it gets. That's about 10–15% of that landscape is culm grassland. So the changes are significant. So we need a blueprint and an approach in terms of how we can restore our habitats and our species back to their former glory and to new glory. And Professor Sir John Lawton, through the Making Space for Nature, coined these phrases. Just, it's quite simple. We need bigger sites in better condition, more of them, and better joined up. And you know, schematics like this got produced about how a landscape might fare and how it might look. All of those components are absolutely critical. You can't have one of those components and for there to be a functioning ecosystem. So our nature reserves are really critical. They're our core areas. That's where wildlife is spilling over, where we're dedicating a lot of time and effort to keep hold of what's so special in our county. But if there's one single symbol of why nature reserves alone are not enough, it's this. This is the fen post in Wicken Fen, I believe. This post, when it was first put in, the soil surface was at the top of the post. So that landscape has dried out. It's basically a peatland, a fen peatland landscape in the fens. And because of surrounding land use and drainage and modern agriculture, that's how much land area has dropped. This is an amazing project, the Great Fen Project. But just looking at it, you can see that you've got an island in the sea of intensively managed, quite hostile habitats. So we need to think at the much bigger scale. This is, again, Sir John Lawton produced this schematic, and I'll just focus on it just for a short period of time. On the y-axis here, on the vertical axis, you've got the amount of management effort that you need to put into a site. And on the x-axis here, the size, and he's got this on a log scale, so goes up squared every time. And he's basically saying that typically in the UK, we have relatively small sites, you know, 10 to 100 hectares perhaps, and our management intensity is very high. In order to bring back wildlife to the scale, you need that but you need to go down that scale and slip down towards the Neps, the Ennerdales, the Palessis, hopefully the gosh, I'll see if I can pronounce it, the Usvars, Plus and Yellowstone. So perhaps we won't ever get to the Yellowstone scale, but we should set our sights high to ensure that we've got some of these sites which are down and towards the bottom right. That's absolutely crucial, and we need a roadmap to help us do that. Although Belarus has been in the press for all the wrong reasons, this is something we should congratulate them on, is to have a really ambitious nature recovery map for their country, showing where there are areas and zones of European significance where conservation will be maximised and prioritised. You get the picture. It's about making sure that we've got large areas available for wildlife. We've done similar in Devon, and it's something that we're upgrading now through what's termed the Nature Recovery Network. So producing a roadmap, an ambitious roadmap of how we should be investing in nature and making sure that we've got at least 30% of our county which is managed for wildlife. And we're at a time now when we can have big influence over future and biodiversity. We've got an Agriculture Act, again, it's been in the press for very wrong reasons over recent days, but an Environment Act as well, which we're really calling for clear and bold targets in terms of how we can restore wildlife and to have those thriving ecosystems for wildlife, but for people. Without wildlife, we will suffer. We have an opportunity now to determine agriculture policy and how we support farming which is regenerative, which helps bind carbon in our soils, which helps support more wildlife, but helps provide great produce for us to eat as well. And we got some great examples, some positives. So in the Colm area, something we've been championing for many years, some of the projects we've delivered have delivered amazing results. So the Working Wetlands Project in Northern Devon NIA that I expect you, so that nature improvement area, have worked with farming communities, built really great relationships over many years, and have restored 5,000 hectares of Colm grasslands, 183 hectares of native woodlands. This is the sort of scale that we need to start working at and replicating county-wide. Even drawn down £15 million for the farming community to be able to support farming and wildlife and sustainable farming systems. But potentially species can play a role as well. So we talked about the beaver earlier, but there are other species that would provide inspiration and also help our special ecosystems in the county. So we virtually lost water voles from Devon, and they're starting to make a comeback. We're looking now at feasibility studies for the reintroduction of pine marten. White-tailed sea eagles have been just seen over Cornwall recently. Probably, I don't know 100% whether they were those released in the Isle of Wight, but sea eagles used to be nesting on Dartmoor 150, 200 years ago. These were a species that our ancestors, well, our great grandfathers and grandmothers would have seen around the county. Perhaps other predators as well in the future, things like lynx. But the thing we really need to rewild is ourselves as well. There's a great philosopher and writer, a chap called Aldo Leopold, who wrote the classic phrase, "We all strive for safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and dullness." We need to make our lives wilder, to connect with nature, to have inspiring experiences, and this is not what it's about. This historically has been, gosh, what planners refer to as green infrastructure. I mean, visually it's appealing, but kids want to be doing this. This is where our treasured memories come from, being in and amongst nature, feeling a sense of danger, I suppose, associated with nature, and excitement and thrill, playing in the woods, having special memories. And these sorts of elements about rewilding our lives are embodied in a few projects that we're involved in at the moment. And one really exciting project is a Green Mines project. We're partnering with Plymouth City Council, who are lead partners, and this was European funded through Urban Innovative Actions. And yes, they're bringing beavers back to Plymouth. So beavers will soon be reintroduced into one of the Plymouth waterways, into a fenced enclosure, but they will be there altering the wildlife biodiversity. People will be able to see them, providing flood risk benefits, but also making our verges, our green spaces in and around the city much more wildlife rich, bringing in a whole range of perennial flowering plants for the insects which we know can be brought into our urban environments, and they're ready to come if we give them the right sort of environment. Lots of wetlands are going to be created in the city, new ways of providing sustainable urban drainage. So this is about just changing mindsets about nature. And putting nature in charge in a lot of places, and not over managing spaces. And a lot of that is about communications and working with communities. That untidy is good, that we can have nature in our city, and we don't need to have them manicured in similar way to that green space that we saw earlier. We're really excited about our Saving Devon's Treescapes project, which we partner with 16, 17 other organisations. But yeah, in urban areas, natural processes don't happen quite so quickly, and you need to give nature a helping hand. And this project is helping us bounce back from ash dieback and planting trees in urban and rural locations, but all outside of woodlands. And we'll be planting 250,000 trees over the next 5 years. And there was a free tree giveaway in Bovey, Tracey on Saturday last week, and will be, I think, in a week or two's time. And this is our community tree nursery here that we set up at Meath, our nature reserve, where we'll be growing trees, locally sourced trees, native from seed, that can get out there in and amongst our urban and rural areas. I'll just quickly talk before I finish up just about our management of the city park. So the Valley Parks in Exeter, we've taken on management. It's partnership with the City Council, but there are 6 large Valley Parks, all about 140 hectares in extent. And these are really the green lungs of Exeter. They're really special places that people can step out from what it's quite an urban area into wildlife rich locations on their doorstep. Here you can see pictures of Ludwell Valley Park, which is Womford there in the background, hospital and so on, and into traditional farmland. But we're there to make those spaces more accessible for people, but more accessible for wildlife as well. This is actually a picture of some of our annual cornflower mixtures, but what we're doing through Viridor Credits support is completely reseeding and oversowing with perennial grasslands, perennial wildflowers, which a vast majority of our insects require. These are super pollen resource and nectar resource, but we need to be providing a lot of those perennial plants for our insects life cycle as well. So there's some great work that's going to be happening at Ludwell through funding from Viridor Credits over the next few years. And we want to be changing scenes like this as well. This is the Northbrook that actually runs through part of Exeter. It's heavily canalised stream, and it's just quite a depressing site, but we've just got funding from the Environment Agency to explore how we can start breaking those waterways out of their channels. I mean, that waterway actually has otters that move through it. Kingfishers are seen frequently. There's minnows, etc. They're there waiting to respond to things like this. This is actually in London, where they've re-wiggled and broken streams out of their catchment and out of their concrete and allowed them to breathe, and for natural processes to start. So we're just looking at feasibility of how we can do that in the Northbrook, which is quite a challenge. To give you some ideas around of things you can do locally, we're running a campaign which is Action for Insects. So many of our insects are in steep decline, some of them facing extinction, and we've got one of the most rare species in the country just clinging on at Prawl Point, which is the six-banded nomad bee. But we can do a lot for insects, and providing some wild space in your gardens and in your communities will make a great deal of difference. And we started a bit of work in Bovey. So this is planting 900 wildflower plugs with the town council. So all perennial species, and ones I grew in my back garden. And next year that will look tremendous, as will some of the other verges in the town. So, you know, we can act locally and make a big difference globally. Slightly conscious of time, but I want to finish on a few notes. As I was starting out my career in conservation, I felt that I needed to go and explore and have that pristine wilderness experience. And what better place to go than New Zealand? And I went to the Fiordland areas of New Zealand, the west coast of the South Island, and was absolutely bowled over by what is as close to natural landscapes as you could possibly have. But I was also equally really depressed because you had pristine and alongside it absolutely trashed, intensively managed, very poorly managed land. And I came to realize that actually it's the mixture of habitats that we have in this county and country. It's that mixture of what we term cultural habitats that we want to, that I think are really special and really important. So having these large areas of pristine, and in order to do that, you over intensify other areas, I don't think is the solution. The solution is finding that matrix and that wilded matrix that we have across our landscapes. And this is actually a view looking down through Emsworthy Mire, down towards Maniton. And what a wonderful mixture of habitats we've got there that is productive. It produces food for us. There's timber that comes from that landscape and wonderful biodiversity as well, probably 30 or 40% woodland cover in that area, and a nice mixture, a really lovely mixture of different habitats. If that's what a wild landscape looks like in our area, then I'm absolutely all for it. I just thought I'd end on that slide. This was one of the chaps that we met in Holland or the Netherlands, who was one of the most enthusiastic advocates for rewilding. So I'll leave it there. I'm conscious I've spoken for slightly too long, but I get carried away when it gets onto this subject. So I'll hand back to the chair and answer any questions people have.
Thanks so much. And I'll hand over to John, who's been collating questions while you've been speaking, and ask him to pass on topics of discussion to you. John.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I don't know whether you picked up Simon's introduction and asking for questions. I've only had one through, and that's the one from Simon, actually. So if you want to ask a question, then text it through using the chat function. So that's I'm on an iPad, and that's on the More function at the top of the screen, and you'll see a line which says chat. And if you send that through and send it through to me, I'll pick that up. I'll pick these questions up. So
if you're on an Android, John, it's on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. If you drag your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see various icons, one of which says chat with a speech bubble on it. And if you click on that, up will come a small pop-up window, and you can type your question into there.
I'm sure all will be revealed. Pete, the question from Simon was, how do you reconcile the tensions between, and you touched on this late on, between the rewilding lobby and the intensive farming lobby? How do you square that circle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question, because we need to, to have really high quality produce. We need to eat, and a good proportion of our land needs to be productive for food. But there's an awful lot of land as well which is not actually very productive from a farmland perspective, but it's potentially extremely productive from a wildlife and what we call ecosystem services, so all the things it can do for us. So there are large tracts of land which are, not producing a huge amount of food, but also not providing a great deal of wildlife and biodiversity output. So there is space. And I think the key thing is then, how do you reward landowners for the produce that they provide that isn't just food? And payment for what the government refers to as public goods is going to be critical. And I think also we do need to think about the food that we eat, and where that food comes from, and making sure that it has the minimum environmental impact, but it's high quality as possible.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, interesting. I've got a question here. What are the good steps to rewild Dartmoor, and why is it not more prominent in the Dartmoor plan?
Yeah, it's a good point. Dartmoor's really is an interesting one, because actually large tracts of Dartmoor are very, very wildlife rich. And I think if you look at the open moor areas, there could be more scrub and more woodland cover. Certainly woodlands forging up through the river valley systems. But yeah, getting the balance right on Dartmoor, I think sometimes can be moving one quite wildlife rich habitat to another. I think some of the large gains are on the surrounding land, and perhaps some of the in-by and the fringing areas of Dartmoor, which are actually often managed quite intensively. But I would look at the in-by land as well, because I think that some of the biggest changes on Dartmoor have been a move from what were traditional hay meadow systems, which would have been around the farms, to ones which are now actually quite intensively managed silage systems. And routine cutting of those does reduce biodiversity value quite significantly. So actually a move to more wildlife rich in-by lands to support and work alongside the commons and the open moor would make a huge difference.
Interesting. Can you see a role for large predators in Devon?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of all the predators that they potentially could be, I mean, lynx are could be, you could consider them in the future, but they do require large tracts of woodland cover. The primary prey would be roe deer, and we just don't really have that woodland cover in the county at the moment. There are others. I think at this stage, one of the predators that we would, and we're looking at feasibility study now, would be pine martens, and the role that they would have, especially in woodland ecology, could be really significant. But yeah, at least for the short medium term, I don't think any large predators would be what we'd be championing for the county. But it's just an anecdote, actually. In this chap on the left there, in Rewilding Europe, we visited an area on the Rhine, on the Rhine Delta, near Nijmegen, and they've rewilded large sections of the floodplain there. And wolves are moving through that landscape and moving in amongst people, generally young young sub-adults that have exploring the landscape, and you know, there isn't a big pushback from the communities there. It's a sense of, largely a sense of excitement that those animals are moving back into probably the most heavily populated areas in the whole of Europe.
That's interesting.
And the difference for us is that we are an island. We physically would have to move those animals into this country, and that's a huge, you know, that's a huge step.
Yeah. It's taken enough to move beavers back. So I recommend a lovely book with a simple message. Simon Barnes, How to Be Wild. Lots to take home messages. I think Simon Barnes was the sports correspondent in the Times, if it's the same person. That's from Terry King. Great talk, thank you. Are there and will there be any volunteer opportunities to help Rewild?
Absolutely, yes. We're always, you know, we're reliant on our volunteers, you know, that support Devon Wildlife Trust's work, and from, you know, supporting work up at the Meath Community Tree Nursery. We'll be growing 5,000 trees a year there. So that's just one example. But yeah, if there are any volunteering queries, then please do get in touch with me, and I can point you in touch with Matt, who is our volunteer coordinator. But yeah, lots of opportunities.
Yeah. Of course, we've got the local volunteering group under Jackie and and Andy Baker. I mean, maintaining the local reserves.
Yes.
So, with the climate changing, how does that tie in with looking back to previous wildlife populations?
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. The best thing we can do for the future is make sure wildlife has got space and has got space to adapt and shift and change. If you consider what often wildlife needs to be able to adapt to climate change is dynamism in the landscape and mosaics and variation. I think we sometimes think too much about, gosh, we've going to have species which are on the south coast of Devon, and they've got to move to the north coast or go further north or further upslope. But when you consider the structure of vegetation, that's where you can get huge temperature changes just by how you can manage. You know, if you've got a tall tussock of grassland, it can be hotter, colder, depending on what side you are of it, whether you've got access to bare ground. It's all that variation and microclimates. If we provide those, then wildlife is much more likely to be able to cope. So that dynamism and variation does help. But yes, space is key, and connectivity as well. I think if we provide that room connectivity, if we get to 30% of our wildlife that's wildlife rich, there's that room for wildlife to move and adapt, and, you know, put it a bit more in charge. And it's got the power to be able to adapt and bounce back.
Thinking about NEP, are there? Can you think of the key messages that come from the NEP experiment, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I think scale is really important, and processes. It really is about those natural processes. I think too, you will get wildlife benefit in some situations if you in effect close the gate on some land, but you will often get a great deal more if you constantly reinvigorate that and catalyze those natural processes, and using analogues or things which replicated herbivores and other creatures of the past. So that change and variation is what makes NEP special. And it's no surprise if you go to our woodland environments, when we coppice woodland, they come alive with various insects. You think of all our fritillary butterflies. So if you have that high woodland, you have that closed canopy woodland, and then you create pockets, change and variation, they can be super wildlife rich. And in fact, even in one place, where you just wouldn't believe would be so diverse, is the high impact zone of Salisbury Plain, an area where high explosives are used and land is turned upside down quite frequently, has got some of our most rare and treasured species there because of that disturbance. And actually those explosions replicate what wild boar would have done in the past, turn land upside down and shift it and move it around. And stable, very overly stable habitats are very important for certain things, but variation and dynamism is needed as well.
I remember the example of the Tamworth pigs on NEP, and how much area they plough up effectively.
And they're your seed beds for the seed, which those pioneer species, which are so critical for so many of our insects. But by this, I don't want the take-home message to be that these large areas of woodland are not what we're after. We are, but we're also after there to be dynamic areas as well, and places of change, and they're critical.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Pete. I think that's all the questions that have come through. I'll hand you back to Simon. Simon, we've still got the screen up here. We haven't got the.
Shall I stop? I'll stop sharing.
That'd be great. Thank you.
That's it. Smashing. Okay.
Great. Well, Pete, thanks for a fantastic talk. Absolutely fascinating, and it certainly has educated us all. It's a subject that I think that is very topical, and I think that it's something that we could all do with engaging with, and all the projects that you're bringing online, like the Action for Insects, are the small things that we as individuals can get engaged with, as well as getting involved with the larger scale things as volunteers and enthusiasts. But thank you so much for a great talk. We've really enjoyed it, and I hope that we'll be able to pass on positive feedback from all our attendees. I think there were 46 people braved the IT, and hopefully they managed to hear every word you said. So we're very pleased about that. So,
I'm sorry we didn't manage a virtual cup of tea and biscuits.
Thank you to all of you who've tuned in, and we'd like to reiterate that we're going to be doing this throughout the winter. Our next talk is on the 17th of November, so the third Tuesday again. And on this occasion, Jasmine Atkinson is going to talk to us about hedgehogs. We'll advertise it in the newsletter. And once again, if you can sign up with Eventbrite, then that gives you access to the talk. You'll notice also on the Eventbrite website, there is the opportunity to make a donation. You'll recall that in our face-to-face meetings, there's an optional donation box on the table as you walk in. That money goes straight through to the Wildlife Trust and helps fund these projects that you've been hearing so much about. So if you do feel like making a contribution, I can guarantee you it'll go to a good home, and we would encourage you to do so. If you have had trouble with using Zoom today, don't despair. Please feel free to email us. You should know our email address, but it's the usual one. It's I will get this right myself. Bovey Tracey LG at devonwildlifetrust.org. So Bovey Tracey LG at devonwildlifetrust.org. And you can send any queries through to us, and we'll do our best to answer them or ask our experts in head office to help us out. Similarly, a plug for the newsletter. Any of you who feel they'd like to, we'd be very pleased to have your contributions about your experiences observing wildlife and your thoughts on different aspects of wildlife activities. And maybe your photographs of your own home-based projects, maybe pollinating gardens or meadow projects, or your own rewilding efforts. Anything you like that would be of interest to our readership, we'd be more than happy to pass on to them. So once again, it's just to me to say thank you again to Pete. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.
And thank you, Simon. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for all your support.
Thank you.
Hey, we are now closing down.